Hello again, and welcome to the 6th lecture in our series on the foundations of Western civilization. You may recall that at the end of the last lecture I said we're now going to bump into the Greeks, and so we shall. Now if I said you were born in Greece, you'd probably say, no I wasn't, I was born in Punxsutawney or someplace. But for a very long time, intellectuals were in the habit of saying, you were born in Greece. The fundamental notion being that somehow the Western tradition was born there, and that there's a straight line from then until now. Now we have spent some time looking at people who lived before the Greeks, or as we'll see in this lecture, contemporaneously with the Greeks, because the Greeks learned things from these people. That's one reason to study them, and because some of them made, as for example with Zoroastrianism, as for example with Phoenician commerce and colonies, as for example with Hebrew religious ideas, some of these people made durable contributions of their own. But now we come to the Greeks, and we'll occupy ourselves with the Greeks over the next several lectures from a number of different points of view. But to get the story started, we must say that civilization in the Greek world began on the Mediterranean island of Crete, lying off the Greek mainland, about 2000 BC. Again, nothing terribly sacred about that date, but that's approximately when we really see civilization taking its rise there. So a bit later than, for example, in the Near East. Now this civilization that arose on the island of Crete, we have always called, well, always for the last couple of centuries, Minoan, from the legendary king Minos, whose palace, may or may not have been his palace actually, but whose great palace was found on the island of Crete. So Minoan civilization attaches to the name of Minos, the legendary king. Now, legend not only attaches to Minos and mystery, it attaches to much else about Minoan civilization. For example, we don't know exactly who these people were. They wrote a great deal. They wrote what we call linear A documents. We don't know the language. It's not Greek, we know that, but it isn't any other known language. Now, I mentioned in the last lecture, you may recall, that today scholars tend to classify people, to organize people by language groupings. So we've got a real problem with the Minoans. We don't know what group to put them in. So we can't give them a history. We can't even give them much of a past, to tell you the truth. We just don't know a lot about them. Now, what we do know comes overwhelmingly from archaeology. Now these Minoans left us some pretty impressive hints about themselves, about what they were like. For example, in the enormous palace complex, this legendary palace of Minos at Knossos. This is an enormous complex. The building itself, the complex of buildings, occupies some 5 acres. It has in its center a great central courtyard, a ceremonial space that was about 55 meters by 25 meters. That's a very large interior space inside a house. Well, of course, this is a royal house, so it's very big. The size, the beauty, the decorations of this palace suggest wealth, suggest leisure, suggest a rather comfortable life, suggest very elaborate aesthetic standards. I'll come back to a couple of those issues in just a moment. But the point is that this palace permits us to make certain inferences, but we don't have the kind of, for example, written documentation or later tradition that permits us to confirm our inferences. Now, one of the things that is true about this palace is that all the way along its exterior flanks are great storehouses. So obviously the kings who lived there stored up various products, cereal, grains, and olive oil, and what have you. And we think that these linear documents, much like, for example, some of the cuneiform documents that we find from Sumer, are bureaucratic records. They're probably attached to the administration of the palace, to the administration of the island of Crete, and perhaps indeed also to the administration of the Minoans' fairly far-flung commercial ventures. So we have a sense of bureaucratic rule. We can infer certain things about a fairly sophisticated administration, even though we cannot, strictly speaking, write its history. Now, the architectural forms, for example, in the palace, and some of the artistic forms in the frescoes, the wall paintings inside the palace. You know what fresco is. Fresco is painting on wet plaster. It is not painting on a dry plastered wall, but it is putting paint actually into the wet plaster so that as the plaster dries, the painted surface in effect becomes part of the surface of the wall. Alas, if a wall falls down, you lose everything, but the point is that a fresco is a fairly durable art form. And fragments of many frescoes have been found from the palace of Minos at Knossos. Now, the artistic motifs that we see and architectural motifs that we see suggest contacts with the Near East and also with Egypt. Well, we know the Minoans were great trading people. We know they were substantial seafarers, so that's not surprising. And here we can see the transfer of ideas, a point that I've raised several times in earlier lectures. But again, we work at the level of inference. We can't work at the level of confirmation. There's some other interesting things about Crete, about Minoan Crete, that permit us inferences. An utter lack of fortifications. None. Not a few, none. These people apparently had no fear of being attacked by anybody. This suggests that they were themselves not aggressive, that they weren't interested in attacking anyone. No fortified harbor complexes, even though they were great traders. No fortified palace complexes, even though they were wealthy and powerful. Now, inside these palaces, we find evidence of a very elegant life. For example, depictions of women wearing cosmetics with beautiful hairdos, with beautiful jewelry and beautiful clothing. Now, no one would paint so lovingly and so accurately and in such great detail were these things not appreciated. And it's probably fair to say that, at least let's say for queens, for princesses, for important women of the court, that these depictions may come close to reality. I don't want to suggest that there's something like photographs. They may come very close to reality. So it may provide us an insight into what gave these people pleasure, what they liked to look at, what seemed pleasing to them. But again, that's an inference. We might say, for example, we have some very interesting depictions of bull leaping. This appears to have been their favorite sport. Now, perhaps you've watched the vault in the Olympics, where an athlete runs down a long runway, leaps into the air, turns over in the air, touches hands on a vault, and springs over the other side of it, perhaps sometimes doing various somersaults and spins and flips in the air. Well, the Minoans did that, except instead of a stationary vault, they went at a running bull. One suggests that the penalty for slipping up was more than getting the judges to give you a bad score. But in any case, it suggests, you see, peaceful sporting activities. Unlike other arts that we see, where military affairs and military men and weapons and so on may be featured, I mentioned the Assyrians in this connection in the last lecture, we don't see that sort of thing. We see peaceful sporting activities. That's what the Minoans present us with. Now, Minoan civilization flourished from about 1800 to about 1550 BC. This is really the high point of Minoan culture. In 1626 BC, there was a volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, about 70 miles away. This caused, apparently, a massive tidal wave, which itself produced heavy damage and may very well have initiated a process of decline on Minoan Crete. Now, coincidentally, this eruption of this volcano on the island of Thera and the disappearance of about half that island into the Mediterranean may be what lies behind the story of the lost city of Atlantis. But we can't actually confirm that. And once again, that's an inference. There's no concrete history there. 75 years or thereabouts after the eruption of the volcano on Thera and the destruction of much of Crete by a tidal wave, the island was conquered. It was conquered from the outside. It was conquered by persons who certainly came from the Greek mainland. It was conquered by people whose early arts and crafts again suggest long contact with the Minoans. These people who conquered the Minoans we call the Mycenaeans. We'll turn to them in just a moment. But we have now moved to the mainland of Greece. Let's pause for just a second and kind of take mental stock of the land of Greece. We may think of the Greeks for their stunning cultural achievements, but the land of Greece is hard and tough and rocky and craggy. The further north you go, the worse the weather is. The further south you go, the hotter the weather. Land. Its soil is not good. This has never been an easy place to eke out a living. we have to remember then that the life of the Greeks is not played out against sort of a wonderful, charming, pleasant geographical background. It's played out in a very tough spot. Now, the earliest hints that we have of the emergence of settled life in Greece go back to perhaps 6500 BC or thereabouts. So 8,500 years ago, we begin to see signs of the Neolithic Revolution in Greece. So we can say that the Neolithic Revolution comes to Europe, comes to the Greek mainland, a little after we see signs of the Neolithic, for example, in Mesopotamia or in Egypt. Now, this is neither here nor there. It doesn't suggest that priority is somehow precedence, but we do see that the Greek world is perhaps a little bit behind. Now, in about 3000 BC, and then again, according to some scholars, perhaps around 2300, according to other scholars, perhaps around 1700 BC, the Balkan Peninsula was subjected to invasions or perhaps migrations from the north. Two fairly substantial movements of people toward the south. All right? Now, they appear to have come from Central Europe, and some may even have come over basically from Anatolia. They may have come round the Black Sea region and down into the Balkans. These people are the historic ancestors of the Greeks. These people really bring the Greeks into the Balkan Peninsula. Now, from as early as 2600 to perhaps 2200, we see the first signs of urban development in the Greek world, and we also find clear evidence of the growth of the Mediterranean triad of crops. This triad of crops, cereal grains, olives, and grapes, have sustained life in the Mediterranean for 10,000 years. If you travel in the Mediterranean world today, you're in an oil culture, not a butter culture. If you travel in the Mediterranean world today, you're much more likely to drink wine than to drink beer. And you will find all of those wonderful products made in one way or another with cereal grains. This has been true for a very, very long time. From about 2000 BC, we can begin to discern a civilization to which we give the name Mycenaean. Now, Mycenaean is not a made-up name. Mycenae is the greatest of the Mycenaean sites. The great citadel at Mycenae. This was the city of Agamemnon, the great hero, the great leader of the Trojans, of the Greeks in the Trojan War. And we'll come back to Agamemnon and his folk in just a few minutes. But Mycenae then gives its name to a period in early Greek history. It is almost certainly these Mycenaeans who conquered Minoan Crete. To be sure, conquered Minoan Crete at a very late stage in its development. They'd probably been learning from them for a long time. They probably grew jealous of them, and they saw that they were ripe for the plucking, and they plucked them. Now, the high point of Mycenaean civilization falls between about 1400 and about 1200 BC. In other words, the couple of centuries following their conquest of Minoan Crete. This is the period of the great cities of Mycenae and Corinth and Pylos, the very cities, for example, that are mentioned in Homer's Iliad. We're going to talk about the Iliad more in a few minutes, but this is basically the world that Homer begins to bring into focus for us. This is a period of massive building projects, for example, at sites like Mycenae. A huge citadel built on the top of a hill, a massive road flanked on each side with stone walls leading up to that great citadel at Mycenae. So these were people who could build quite impressive structures, who could build quite impressive buildings. It was a time, we think, of very considerable wealth. The Mycenaeans seem to have sustained themselves mainly by agricultural pursuits in the Greek mainland, but also by engaging in overseas trade, in overseas contacts, in overseas commerce, and in having contacts with people overseas as well. We know about the Mycenaeans from three different kinds of evidence. In the first place, we have a great collection of what are called linear B documents. Now, there are thousands of these. Again, it turns out they are overwhelmingly bureaucratic records. We didn't find the first edition of the Iliad or something like that in these documents. It would have been lovely to have done so, but we didn't. The linear B documents differ from the linear A documents in a couple of very important respects. The first and fundamental one is we can read them. We can read these documents. Now, for a very long time, nobody could read them. We still can't, as we've seen, read the Linear A documents. We don't know what the language is. Well, for a long time, prevailing archaeological theory held that the Greeks came into Greece sort of after about 1200 BC. And therefore, theory held, those people before 1200, whatever they might have been, weren't Greek. So people went and looked in one place after another for the language in these Linear B documents. Right after the Second World War, a group of individuals led by an Oxford classicist by the name of Michael Ventris, they had all worked at Bletchley during World War II. These were the Enigma code breakers. Very interesting people to put to work on the task of puzzling out a language. So they assembled all this brain power, and they were going to crack this code. Ventris gets the bright idea, maybe it's Greek, but written in a different script. Hello, it's Greek. So actually they didn't need all that brain power in the long run. It took one simple flash of brilliant insight. And now it was possible to read these documents and, by the by, to adjust earlier archaeological theory. These people are speaking Greek, writing Greek, they're probably Greek in some way or another. Now, one other interesting thing to say about the Linear B documents before we leave them is you may be puzzled by what does this linear mean? Well, it means simply writing that is arrayed in lines. You think, well, that doesn't sound terribly interesting. I mean, cuneiform could be arrayed in lines. Hieroglyphics would be arrayed in lines. But it is writing that is arrayed in lines running from left to right, you see, across the page. But it is a particular kind of writing. And that's the point that I want to just put a little bit of emphasis on at the moment. It is syllabic writing. We can have basically three kinds of writing. We have talked already about pictographs, hieroglyphics, for example, picture writing, where pictures stand for nouns and verbs, and then colored in certain ways can give us the other array of words, adjectives, adverbs, and so on, that modify things, and various connective words. Picture writing, as we saw, not terribly efficient. Syllabic writing is more efficient. The demotic, for example, that began to be used on papyrus in Egypt is syllabic writing. Cuneiform is syllabic writing. The languages which the cuneiform symbols represent are laid out syllabically. It's almost certainly the case the Linear A documents are like that too. We just know what the language is. And the Linear B documents are laid out this way as well. Now, what on earth does this mean, syllabic writing? It's vastly more efficient than pictographs, but a lot less efficient than alphabetic writing, to which I'll come in just a second. Syllabic writing, let's suppose we were going to make up a syllabary for English. We would have to have a symbol for every possible sound combination. So I would have to have one for ba, ka, da, fa, ga. Then I'd have to have one for bo, ko, do, fo, go, and so on. But I'd have one symbol for each of those sound possibilities. And I could array them, and that's not so bad, but it makes a lot of symbols. What I can do beyond that is alphabetic writing. I can have a certain number of letters, from aleph and beth in Hebrew, alpha, beta in Greek, you see. I can have a certain number of letters, and I can assign each one of them a sound value. And then, of course, what I can do is create all sorts of irregularities to terrorize school children down through the centuries. But that's another story entirely. I can assign sound values to letters so that each letter holds a place of its own and makes its own sound and forms new sound in combination with other letters. The Greeks are going to learn an alphabet in our next lecture. They're actually going to borrow an alphabet from the Phoenicians. But at the moment, they're writing in linear syllabic writing. So, three kinds of writings: pictographs, syllabic writing, alphabetic writing. We've had two. We'll get the alphabetic in our next lecture. All right. What do the Linear B documents tell us? Well, as I said a moment ago, a world of bureaucracy. I'm going to come back to that point a little bit in connection with Homer in a minute, because if you've ever read the Iliad, there's not a lot of bureaucracy in the Iliad. So are things slightly out of step? We'll come back to that. In the second place, archaeology. The second way we know about the Mycenaeans is archaeology. Massive and impressive remains found at the sites of these great cities. Found at Mycenae, found at Pylos, found at Tiryns, found at Corinth, and so on. These people built big palaces. not big temples, big palaces. Now remember when we talked about Mesopotamia, we saw that temples might need the predominance of temple priesthoods, palaces might need the predominance of kings, walls and palaces might mean kings and warrior aristocracies. Now, if you've read the Iliad, you have certainly meant powerful warrior kings and powerful warrior aristocracies. That begins to sound a little bit more like, that is to say, the archaeology now begins to sound a little bit more like the world that we actually encounter, you see, in Homer's Iliad. So we have a sense then of powerful rule, of local strong men, of strongly exercised leadership. All right? Now, the next type of source, the next thing that permits us to draw inferences about this Mycenaean world are the Homeric poems. Now, the Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and as you probably know, there are all sorts of theories about the Iliad and the Odyssey, you know, that they weren't written by Homer, they were written by another guy whose name was Homer, or that they were written by two different guys, and they've been confidently dated to a lot of different moments and a lot of different places and so on. We don't have time here to pursue all of these issues. We'll skate through them rather safely, I think. The Homeric poems, but particularly the Iliad, the poem about Ilion. Ilion is Troy. The Iliad is the great poem about the Trojan War. It's the Mycenaean heroes, Agamemnon and company, going over to fight on the coast of Anatolia, to fight at Ilion, or what we call Troy. They're very controversial poems. They're very controversial sources. Why? First of all, it is clearly a large body of oral material that is circulating in all sorts of different forms over a long period of time. Let me give you one example of this. If you've ever read the Iliad, for example, and you kind of remember the various gods and goddesses and the jobs they have, then you might have read one or another of the Greek plays. And you've encountered those very same gods and goddesses, and they got different jobs. Obviously, the stories of the old days were remembered differently in different places. Round about 800, it appears that the Homeric Iliad, and perhaps the Odyssey as well, began to be put into something like the shape in which we now have them. They began to be kind of assembled as a corpus of material. Probably by about 725 BC or thereabouts, they had begun to achieve almost a kind of canonical status in the growing Greek cities. In other words, now there really was a way that you had to tell this story. People had certain expectations about how the story would be told. By about 550 BC, the poems were written down for the first time. Now, that's a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because they stabilized. It's a bad thing because it killed a living tradition. It froze it, never to grow anymore. But our problem as historians is to say, how on earth do we use a poetic corpus built, as it were, between 800-ish and 550-ish BC to tell us about a world that played itself out between 1400 and 1200? That's the puzzle. How do we use the Homeric poems? Now, the poems purport to tell us about the old days, to tell us about those people. So the problem is, what do they tell us? What can they tell us? Well, for a long time, there was a great deal of skepticism on these subjects, and there was a battle that went back and forth in the scholarly world. To put this battle in its very simplest terms, there are some who said the Homeric poems are works of art. They spring full-blown from the mind of a great bard, a great rhapsode, a great teller of tales, Homer, whoever he was. And what we have is his artistic vision. Others said, no, that's not how we should understand the making of the Iliad and the Odyssey. We should understand them as oral formulaic poetry. Now, oral formulaic poetry, again, if you've ever read the Iliad, and you know about rosy-fingered dawn and the wine-dark sea and wide-ruling Agamemnon and Diomedes of the loud war cry, you see, all of these formulas that recur again and again and again because they fit a certain metrical pattern. It's not unlike sitting around of an evening with a great group of friends and you're making up verses to a song as you go along. Well, you got to kind of stick with the theme of the song and you have to stay with the beat of the music, you see. All right, so people can build poems that way. Well, if that's the case, then is this thing simply a free-for-all? In other words, if it's a composed epic by Homer, whoever Homer was, then we really aren't authorized to say that this Homer guy knew very much about Mycenae, and therefore we can't really read the poem for that, though we can appreciate it as great poetry. But if it's oral formulaic poetry, we say there's no rules here. People are kind of making it up as they go along. Well, after the Second World War, two Harvard scholars, Milman Parry and Albert Lord, who had worked in Yugoslavia during the Second World War with the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor of the CIA, working with various groups in the Balkans, attempting to hold that territory against Nazis in the first place, against possible Soviet incursion in the second place. One of the things they discovered up there was a local bardic tradition. There were singers of songs, tellers of tales up there. And they discovered some of these guys who could keep in mind up to 500,000 lines of material. 500,000 lines of material. Now, we've encountered this, I suppose, most recently in something like Alex Haley's famous book, Roots, and the television series Roots, where Haley went back to the Gambia and found the storytellers and had them start reciting the tale until he began to hear things that resonated. And then he tried to start stitching this tale together. We might think also, for instance, of performers today. Think of a really good sort of popular singer. How many lyrics must that person know? It's an enormous number of things. Think of a great actor, Laurence Olivier. How many scripts must he have had in mind? He did every Shakespearean play in his life. Now, I don't suppose necessarily at every minute he could remember every line from all of them, but he must have had an awful lot of it in mind. We don't exercise our memories today the way we did in earlier times, the way people did generally in earlier times. So the capacity to remember large amounts of things and to hand it on quite faithfully makes it legitimate to think that this oral formulaic poetry was not playing in a game with no rules and did in fact transmit down over the centuries a great deal of quite substantial and accurate and authentic information. Having said that, and probably at that stage today almost no one would disagree, we get to the hard part. Okay, how much of it's authentic? What of this material is really accurate? Well, the Mycenaean elements in the story are likely to be among the most basic and concrete. Names of characters. There's no reason for those to change. Names of places. There's no reason for those to change. There are certainly hints of warfare in the old days. There are some problems with that. Iron weapons crop up a couple of times in the Iliad. Well, there was no iron weapons at Mycenae. That was still the Bronze Age. There are some references, for example, to military armaments, to armor, that didn't really appear at the time of Mycenae and almost certainly did appear later on. So there's a certain amount of basic information in the Iliad that is almost certainly authentic and that has come down from earlier times. What kinds of things? Well, let's remind ourselves, it's a story about the Trojan War. Now, the Greek tradition remembered the Trojan War as having taken place 1194 to 1184 BC. It took place for 10 years. The Iliad shows us the battlefield in the very last stages of that war. Quite remarkably, scholars today actually peg the Trojan War at between 1225 and 1200 BC. So there's one place. The tradition is remarkably close in remembering when this war took place. Now, it almost certainly was a Mycenaean war against the Trojans, against the people on the other side of the Aegean Sea. Alas, it was not a war launched by the beauty of Helen, whose face could send all these men off to fight and to die. It was probably a grotty little trade war, fought in the Aegean Basin. Probably it came at the end of a long series of contentions in this part of the world, and later on was remembered in much grander, in much more heroic terms. All of this seems quite certain. So there's lots of basic nuts and bolts of information, nuggets of information, if you will, hiding in the Iliad that are useful to us, along with the Linear B documents and the archaeology in reconstructing the Mycenaean world. But surely, you'll say, it's the ethical teachings of the Iliad. It's the wrath of Achilles that we really want to think about. It is all those remarkable people and the things that they did and said or failed to do. All of that is almost certainly from the world of Homer himself and not from the world of Mycenae. And it's to that ethical world of Homer, of the Greek Dark Ages and the Greek Archaic period, it's to that we'll turn in our next lecture.